I hate you. I hate them. I hate everyone. I hate myself. You see, hatred is one of the most powerful emotions human beings can feel. But the good news is that it can be used to bring about positive change. Look at the founding fathers. They hated this system where they were controlled by an absolute monarch on the other side of the world. They hated that system and they worked to change it, to create a new country that became the most powerful country on the face of the earth. Look at Martin Luther King Jr., someone who hated racism, hated that people were judged by the color of their skin and not the content of their character. He hated that system and he worked to change it. Hatred can be used for good, but it can also be used to unleash the forces of absolute destruction. Look no further than Heinrich Himmler, someone who enabled the collective hatred of an entire nation to come together and commit one of the worst atrocities humanity has ever known. So in this episode, we are going to be analyzing Heinrich Himmler's life, philosophy, and psychological problems, especially his negative father complex. My name is Michael McCauley, and you are listening to Biocast. What's our goal here? Understanding history one person at a time. In this episode, we are going to be analyzing the life of Heinrich Himmler, someone that doesn't just teach us a lot about political extremism, but he also teaches us a lot about the negative father complex, fatherhood in general, and a whole lot more. Thank you so much for tuning in, and without any further ado, let's get right in to the episode. Heinrich Himmler was born in 1900. Exactly. One of those nice dates to be born on, so you don't have to think about how old you actually are. You just have to remember, oh, it's 1927. I'm 27 years old. Pretty nice year to be born. He was born to a conservative Catholic family in Munich, and Munich is the capital of Bavaria, so already that's kind of setting him up to have a certain kind of mindset going forward. People in Germany at this time were particularly conservative, but in Bavaria and Munich, they were especially conservative. And Himmler was very lucky in a lot of ways because he was born to parents who were upper middle class. They had some connections, they had a decent amount of wealth, they didn't have to worry about becoming completely impoverished and destitute if, there was some kind of accident that happened. They were what you would call the professional working class. And his father actually was the headmaster of a local school, and he got his first name from Prince Heinrich of Bavaria. And that's going to be really important because Prince Heinrich of Bavaria is the Himmler's connection to royalty. Prince Heinrich of Bavaria is fairly upper class. He's kind of the aristocracy, you would call it. I mean, he's not professional working class. He is somewhere in line to become the Kaiser kind of aristocracy. He was really up there. And by having this connection in the Himmler family, this is going to really be a safety net for the family, so to speak. They're going to be able to have connections, to be able to do things, get into schools, and just things that were not available to the ordinary German were going to be available to them because of this one connection. And if you've ever seen what Heinrich Himmler looks like, whether it's this picture from when he was a kid or any picture at all, you can probably guess that he was athletically challenged. He was not someone that was going out and winning fights and playing sports and doing that kind of stuff. He was kind of a scrawny kid, kind of small, kind of looked like a nerd. I mean, even as an adult, he just kind of looked like a nerd, right? Now, the really interesting part is when Wolfgang Halgaten, the later German-American historian, he literally refused to believe the child he had gone to school with, known as Himmler, was the notorious Reichsführer SS. He literally had a class with Himmler as a kid, and he could not believe that kid became the Heinrich Himmler. Helgaten had described the young Himmler as a, quote, child of hardly average height who was unusually pale and physically very awkward, with hair cut fairly short and even then a pair of gold-rimmed glasses on his slightly pointed nose. So definitely a nerd. And I've done a couple of Biocast episodes on Nazi leaders in the past, and it's really forced me to take a step back and to wonder, okay, what are the commonalities between all of these people? And one of the things that I've noticed is that they always have some kind of physical ailment. They were sick as kids. They were a little socially awkward. I mean, this is almost like a universal thing. And not even just Nazis. I mean, the dictators in general, because Joseph Stalin falls into this category as well. They are just sickly children. They're kind of weak. They're a little weird. They're just all these weird commonalities. And you almost have to wonder if being socially awkward or physically weak or inert, if it almost makes you more likely to become some kind of dictator or someone that's some kind of political extremist. But we can save a little bit more of that banter for later on in the episode, because there will be plenty more of that to come. And you always have to appreciate when kids are into politics, and Helgaten had remembered Himmler's anti-French outlook even from the time he was a young kid. So even from the time that he was just this little kid going to your typical school, probably like 9 or 10 years old, he had this very anti-French, pro-German outlook. And I'm sure that was very stereotypical at that time. I mean, this is Bavaria in 1910 or, whenever it was, right? It's just very common. The interesting thing you gotta note about Himmler, though, is that he was not the stereotypical nerd, at least in every aspect of his young life, because he did make quite a few friends that lasted, some of them for the rest of his life during that time. So it's not like he had zero friends and he was just alone all the time. He was sociable with some people, but it just wasn't very many people. And like I was saying earlier, about how there are some commonalities that I've noticed with political extremists and dictators and tyrants, all these different kinds of crazy people. One of the things that is almost universally true is that they have cruel and abusive fathers. And Heinrich Himmler is definitely not an exception to this. His dad, that schoolmaster, he was extremely cruel. So much so that most of what we know about his cruelty as a human being comes from people that are not his own family. I mean, people that observed him, people that were his former students or, whatever have you. People that interacted with Himmler's father wrote about how mean and sadistic he really was. Now I'm going to give you a brief overview of a story a German student of his wrote years later that was published in a newspaper long after the war, and it was only in very distant retrospect that he had written this story. And it goes something like this, right? So Rex, this schoolmaster, is a strict, feared headmaster of this small school. He appears on a surprise visit to the class. And then he starts arguing with one of the confident pupils and eventually expels him from the school altogether. So this may have been a good pupil, but he was arguing with the headmaster. That can't be tolerated, so sorry man, you're expelled. So then he calls on another student to get in front of the class. And then Rex parades with positive pleasure at the boy's pathetic Greek with mean-spirited sarcasm and malice. So he kicks the good student out for talking back, and then he takes this poor student, gets him in front of the classroom, basically humiliates him in front of everyone, and then he just kind of takes pleasure in making this kid feel bad about, not being the best at Greek. Basically what he's doing. And then this student too, this poor student, is obliged to leave the school as well. Rex was Heinrich Himmler's father. And the man who wrote this years later did not claim this was a completely true story, but it was meant to illustrate the kind of teacher that Rex really was. And if this is the kind of person that he is with students, Imagine the kind of person he is with his own children. That is what raised Heinrich Himmler. Now, this is where we can start talking about some of the really interesting concepts that are going to be present throughout the rest of this episode. So, Heinrich Himmler, rebelled against his conservative father to become this radical right-wing revolutionary. That is kind of the way that his life had been framed for a very long time. But if we really begin to sit down and analyze this kind of relationship dynamic between this father and his son, another story, another narrative begins to make itself apparent. We're going to talk about psychology for a minute, specifically the negative father complex. Now, before we move any further, I just want to explain what exactly a complex is. A complex basically refers to all of the feelings, emotions, and ideas that you have that surround whatever particular thing. So, in the case of the negative father complex, it's all of those negative emotions that you have that surround your relationship with your father. Maybe your father is extremely strict. He doesn't let you do anything. He doesn't let you brush your own teeth without being supervised or asking for permission to do so, right? So you would have a complex where you would have that expectation. You would have a certain preconceived notion of what that relationship dynamic was going to be like. The Scottish psychiatrist Ronald Fairbairn theorized that a child could develop two split images of the parent, the extreme negative, or the reality, and the positive ideal. Fairbairn theorized that this was due to a child's need to love and be loved by a parent, even if the parent is extremely negative. That is really, really important to get your head around. So a child could have certain positive ideals toward their parent, whether it was their father or their mother, no matter how horrible they may be, might be the worst father on earth. But because this child needs to be loved and to love, right, to have this reciprocal relationship on some level, will create some kind of positive ideal about their parent. And you almost have to speculate, did this happen to Heinrich Himmler? And as we move through the story of Heinrich Himmler, I'm going to plant this seed in your mind right now. Heinrich Himmler adopts his father's negativity and turns it into his own. He does not rebel against his father. He may not have been exactly the same politically as his father, right? He came away from Christianity. He came away from general conservative politics overall. And he created this really a new ideology, right? He joined this Nazi movement. It's not left and it's not really right. It's kind of like a new thing in a lot of ways. So it's not so much a rebellion as it is adopting certain elements of this and that, and he steals or adopts his father's negativity. Just think about it for a minute, right? Rex casually torments his students and has no remorse about it, even enjoys it, right? He was tormenting that one kid with pleasure. He enjoyed doing it. And then Himmler, later on when he became an adult, casually tormented the Untermenschen, or the subhumans, with no remorse. There are literally pictures you can go look at right now. Pictures of Himmler visiting the concentration camps and smiling at people. Smiling at these people that were literally in death camps. Think about that. Are these two people that different? Are they? I really don't think they are. They might not be exactly the same on every political issue, on every element. I don't even think Rex was as bad as Himmler was. But they're still in that same category. There are some commonalities between the two. And I'm going to make the case that Himmler got this cruelty and expanded upon it because of his father. That's where that negativity came from, and he just fostered it until he became someone that was so full of hate that he literally became the architect of a genocide. And when you take a step back and really analyze some of these guys, think about Hitler, right? he was in a very similar circumstance. His father was extremely cruel, extremely abusive, beat him, had a bunch of different wives and cheating on his mother, all this horrible stuff. Despite all of that horror, Hitler still idealized his father. And how many other countless men that, there are just no records or way to ever confirm or deny, but how many of these men that got so wrapped up in the Third Reich had a similar thing going on with their dads? Dads who were extremely abusive and strict and condescending and sadistic. And then these young men adopted that negativity, and it all came out in the Third Reich. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a psychologist. There's no way I could ever confirm or deny any of this stuff. A lot of these guys are dead, and, you'd really be sitting around doing, analyzing their diaries and stuff. I'm not sure where you could even go with that. But it's just an interesting idea to keep in the back of your head as we go forward. When World War I breaks out, Himmler becomes obsessed. It's his favorite thing to read about, to think about. He's rooting for Germany. He really wants them to win. Understandably so. This is someone that, at the very least is somewhat conservative, someone that's very pro-German, and someone that, they're fighting the French, right? He hates the French. He just wants German supremacy. Like a lot of other people at the time, maybe not even supremacy. They just want the best for their nation, right? Who doesn't want that? But it's really interesting because you almost have to think about it through our modern lens, because we don't have people like this anymore, right? How many people do you know are checking social media all day and see that, 500 Iraqis have been bombed and killed, or, wherever it is what America's at war, right? No one's sitting around rooting and saying, yeah, man, USA. Like, no one does that anymore. If you see anyone that's rooting for, someone else in a similar fashion, sports fans, right? Think about how hyped up they get, how excited they are when their team wins, or how disappointed they are when their team loses. Think about this for a moment, right? He literally goes to the newspaper every single day to write patriotic passages. Quote, "Now we are making terrific progress. I'm as happy at these victories as the English and French are, no doubt annoyed at them, and the annoyance will be considerable. Falk and I would really like to fight right now ourselves. It's clear that the good old Germans and their loyal allies, the Austrians, are not afraid of a world full of enemies." So you can really get the tone that he's writing with here. He's very pro-German, and you can almost see the underlying assumption here, right? The good old loyal allies, the Austrians. So of course, you can even see this ethno-nationalist undertone in this writing, as far back as 1914. And I think that really gives you a good indication of how it was a really slippery slope that Germany became the Third Reich. Things went the way they did. As horrible as it was, a lot of people had just certain ideas, certain mindsets, certain predispositions. And looking back, I think we can all appreciate how frustrating it must have been to have been an ethnic and cultural and linguistic German, and then you see that, there's an entire other country of people that are just like you, that aren't in your country, that aren't united. And, oh, well, what do you know? If we just united, we could all come together and it could be like one really big, powerful country. There are a lot of people thinking things like that during this time, and it's not going to be very long before they get their wish. But oh boy, if only it had been under slightly different circumstances. Now, whenever a war breaks out, I think it's pretty common that young men who can't fight, they're just too young, they kind of start to develop this feeling of, oh man, I want to go be part of this too, let me in the military. Very common phenomenon that starts going on when one of these big wars break out. But the level of patriotism that Heinrich Himmler feels goes way beyond that. Way beyond that typical surface level amount. He literally gets envious of his brother who gets to visit a wounded soldier. So imagine a war breaks out, your brother gets to visit a wounded soldier, you're jealous of that. you want to be the one going to visit wounded soldiers. I mean, just think about the level of extreme loyalty and patriotism that encompasses. And as you might imagine, he's doing everything he can in his power to start getting in that military. He doesn't care how young he is, he wants to get in now. So he starts his preliminary military training in 1915. And it's really interesting because, again, it goes back to that family connection. Prince Heinrich of Bavaria, who was able to secure him a spot in officer training despite having this horrible vision. Right? Himmler always has those glasses for the rest of his life. Horrible vision. Just horrible. Can't see anything. Probably legally blind. He would be legally blind if he was alive today. But that's going to be the last time that Prince Heinrich of Bavaria helps out the Himmlers, because he gets killed while fighting in Romania. And this is horrible news for the Himmlers, because it means their one connection to the aristocracy, their one ticket, their one safety net is gone. And once that's gone, oh boy, a lot of other things go bad. And I just want you to imagine the complete disappointment Himmler must have felt after World War I ended. Because it ended, he was in officer training school all this time. He never even sees a day of combat. He doesn't even finish his training. So he's waiting all this time to fight in the military, fight for Germany. The war ends and he never even gets to do anything. And oh boy, is he going to overcompensate for that down the road. Himmler is extremely patriotic, extremely nationalistic, and he lives during the greatest war Germany has faced as a nation up to that point. And then it happens, he doesn't even get to fight in it, and then they lose. They lose the war. It's over, and there's nothing he can do about it. He can't contribute, he can't help, and he can't turn back the clock. I mean, just think about it for a minute. This is someone who regularly referred to himself as a soldier as a kid and leading up to the war, before he even started officer training school, before he was ever even part of the military in any capacity, he was already referring to himself as a soldier for the German nation. And now Himmler is going to be part of a generation in Germany that sees the major event of their lives being Germany's defeat and surrender in World War I, and Germany's liberal revolution that took it away from an absolute monarchy and created this liberal democratic state, something that would later be called the Weimar Republic. And this is going to be such an embarrassment. It's going to be such a humiliation. And it's a little interesting too, because you have to think about it like this. Why did so many German people hate liberalism and democracy and basically freedom to the people? The ability to choose their own government. Why was this viewed as such a bad thing? I would make the case that it's because it is so closely associated with this major loss, losing World War I, hyperinflation, an ineffective government, things not getting done, being occupied by your most antagonistic enemy ever, France, coming in, taking your stuff. I think you can really understand why there would be such a negative connotation associated with liberalism. Because you look at some other countries, normally the revolution happens, then there's a war after. But with Germany, it's war first, then a revolution. And it's not just a big war, it is a major war. I mean, think about it in the history of warfare. It's probably only smaller in comparison to World War II. Really, World War I, the entire world was at war. It's actually a very fitting name. And the idea that you come out on the other side of that event, you lose, then you have this revolution, not because that's what you wanted as a collective group of people, but because you lost this war, because the politics of the area and the way things had happened, they kind of forced you to have your liberal revolution. So that happens, you lose your monarch, you lose your traditional way of life, and then you get occupied by your enemies. And that is going to be the major event that this generation of young German men find themselves living under. And you can understand why there was so much hatred amongst them. And you see, there are a couple of major political schools of thought during this time. One of the big ones is just, people like Himmler that viewed liberalism and democracy completely bad. They didn't want to be associated with that garbage in their country anytime soon. They wanted to keep that crap away. They wanted to stick to what worked, absolute monarchy, right, with the Kaiser, and they just wanted to stick to their way of life. They viewed it as their way of doing things. But then you had, on the other side of the political spectrum, the communists. They were a major group, a major force during this time as well. And they viewed this liberal revolution as not enough. This wasn't far left enough. Not enough change has gone on to please the working classes, to liberate the working class people. So they're not happy. These reactionary right-wingers, they're not happy. So the actual number of people who are happy with what has just occurred is a very, very small number of people. And now we get to discuss one of the most important things that happens after World War I, at least within Germany, because it's going to lay the groundwork for a lot of things going forward, not only in the culture, but especially in the politics. And that is going to be the stab in the back narrative. Now, some people call it the stab in the back myth, the stab in the back story, whatever it is. It basically goes like this. So, while the hard-working German soldiers, they were out fighting for their nation, serving the Kaiser, fighting those sworn enemies, namely the French, the Americans, the British, anyone else, the Russians, they were out fighting this war. They were out there winning. But you see, what happened was this liberal revolution happened, and then these Jewish social democrats, they came on in and they betrayed the German military. Because if you look at it on the ground, the Germans were doing pretty well. The Germans made a lot of progress. They probably could have won the war, but their own politicians surrendered. Now, keep in mind, we have the benefit of all the information about this time period available to us. If you want to know some specific detail or some kind of statistic from this time period, we can look that up on the internet. They didn't have that during this time, though. And they believed, the German people, they believed that they should have and could have won World War I. And again, there was an argument to be made until the Americans got involved. You see, America enters the war in 1916. They got all these fresh troops. They got so much more supplies now. And that really changes the tides for the way this war was going to end. Changes everything. And it basically makes a German victory impossible. But you see, the people in Germany, they don't want to believe that. And can you blame them? Really think about it. Does anyone want to admit, yeah, our military just wasn't strong enough. We bit off more than we can chew and we lost. So I guess that makes us losers. No one wants to say that. No one wants to admit that. I mean, look at how America responded to Korea or Vietnam. These are not viewed as defeats. The government tries to spin them like, yeah, it was a stalemate. We tried to invade. We were equally compared in military might, and we decided that no more people should die. And we called it equal, we called it a truce, and that was that. But take a step back. What was the goal here? What was the intention? The intention was not to get a stalemate. It was to invade, to change the governing regime, for resources, whatever it may have been. No one goes into a war looking for a stalemate. No one. They want a victory. I want you to transport your mind Put yourself in the shoes of an ordinary, fairly patriotic German citizen living in Germany at this time. You live through this event. Every day you're checking the newspapers to see what is going to happen with this war. Good things for Germany means good things for you, personally, for your family, for your children. And then you look one day in the newspaper, and Germany is defeated. Now, there are two versions of reality you can make peace with. Number one, Germany is just a country full of people who don't really know what they're doing. Their military isn't that great. They're not very good. Maybe the soldiers aren't that well trained. Maybe your son is fighting in that military. Maybe your father is fighting in that military. Maybe you have an entire family tradition going back generations of fighting in the German military. And you can make peace with the fact that maybe they're just not that good at fighting. Maybe they're just losers. That's what they are. They're losers who couldn't win the war. Or alternate reality number two, where they were great soldiers. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew how to win this war. They were going to win everything, and it was all going to be okay. Until they got stabbed in the back. And who stabbed them in the back? The communists, the socialists, and the Jews. That's who did it. They sold your military out. Your son, your father, your family's tradition of fighting selflessly and heroically for this military. Fighting for your people. It was betrayed. By people who hate Germany. By people who want to fundamentally change the German government. Who want to get rid of the Kaiser. Who want to implement socialism. People who are not the same religion as you. People who have a different tradition. People that are not your people. Those are the people that stabbed your son in the back. Which of these two realities is easier to cope with? And that is the version of reality so many people chose to believe. And as more and more people shifted to the radical right, they started referring to these liberal revolutionaries as the November criminals. They weren't liberators who were trying to liberate the German people from an overbearing government with a monarchy. They weren't liberators. They were criminals who stabbed you in the back. Now, are you just going to take that? You're not going to punish these people for what it is that they did? And it was a fairly long list of people, right? Socialists, centrists, Jews, communists, even Catholics became the targets of attacks by the radical right. And you know, something like this has gotten out of hand when some of the real big names in your society start attaching themselves to these ideas. I mean, look at the World War I German general Erich Ludendorff. He becomes obsessed with all of these theories, blaming Jews and communists and socialists and Catholics and Christians and anyone else. I mean, Ludendorff eventually became so radical that the Nazis had to distance themselves from him. That's how much of a nut job he was. But he's not the only person that started buying into these ideas. A lot of the big names in German society started buying in to the stab in the back narrative. And this is going to lay the groundwork for a genocide. And then you had people like Alfred Rosenberg, who attributed blame completely to the Jews. You see, it wasn't just Jews conspiring with some of these other groups, it was the Jews alone. And then he cited the British Balfour Declaration. But what was the Balfour Declaration? Funny you ask. The Balfour Declaration was a promise from the British government that if they won this war, they were going to give the Jewish people a national state in Palestine. So, you can really see where the motivation from the Jewish community would be to stab Germany in the back. And I just want you to think about the history of the Jewish people for a moment. These people kicked out of country after country, always being a nomad, being a stranger, an outsider, always looking for a new home, trying to start a new life in a new society with new people and a new language. It's a lot. It's really a lot. So you can understand why there were so many Jews who wanted to create this national state, a state for the Jewish people, so they didn't have to continue to find a new country every couple of generations. You can really understand why they would be motivated to do this. And especially when you get a promise from the British government. I mean, they were the most powerful country on the face of the earth at the time. They promise you your own country. What are you gonna do? Say no? And then you couple this with the general anti-Semitism that was going on in the country at the time, and you can really understand how the Jews became this target of attack. It wasn't just that they became a scapegoat one day all of a sudden for no reason. I mean, there were a lot of major events that led to the Jews becoming the ultimate scapegoat. And this whole Balfour Declaration thing was a big part of that. You know, I'm not saying that they definitely did or didn't betray Germany, but it definitely made it a possibility. At least for the people who wanted a Jewish national state. And it was so bad at certain points that they literally accused the Jews of not serving in the military. They were like, listen, these Jews that are in our country, they're not even fighting in the military. So of course they stabbed us in the back. Well, of course, they ran a consensus in the military to see how many Jews were actually in there. And then it turned out that they were overrepresented in the German military. And then of course the radical right-wingers, they started to cover that up. It didn't fit the narrative. It didn't go along with this grand conspiracy by the Jews to betray Germany and not help out in any way and just take and take and take. Didn't fit the narrative. So they hid that fact. And you see, the problem is that there was just such an abundance of radical right-wing propaganda all over the place. All over the place. It was being printed everywhere. And if you were someone that, even leaned moderately right, you could find yourself becoming a sympathizer. I mean, all you have to do is read a certain newspaper a couple of times over the course of a few weeks. Maybe you meet someone that's really influential, really persuasive, and they talk you into it. I mean, that's exactly how otherwise ordinary people get wrapped up into these radical politics. And of course, the entirety of the Nazi Party wanted to bring justice to these November criminals, especially Adolf Hitler. He particularly hated these people, these November criminals. And of course, who was overrepresented in the November criminals? The Jews. Of course, what do you know? And Himmler, man, this guy, he eats this stuff up. He loved it. He loved reading radical right-wing propaganda. He did it all the time. He just loved this stuff. Well, he found himself going back to school in 1921, in post-war Germany. Now, despite being a little bit older at this point, he was still very dependent on his parents. Very dependent on them financially, emotionally, psychologically even. And this kind of really shows you that Himmler was a dependent person. There's been a lot of research into the mind of Heinrich Himmler. And a lot of people have noticed a certain pattern. A pattern of emotional immaturity. And having this certain expectation that could never be fulfilled. He had certain expectations from people he knew, from casual relationships, that could just never materialize in any meaningful way. Like, he would just expect the world of people. He would expect these really intimate, really close relationships and bonds and these heart-to-heart talks. It never went that way. Never. He never got that emotional or psychological intimacy. And that doesn't mean with a woman. I mean, just from a friendship perspective. I mean, bonding with his parents. These are things that he just never got. This resulted in one thing. he was always disappointed. And this is one of those bits of information that I personally find so interesting. Because if you look at the person he eventually became, and you sat back and you asked yourself, what did this guy do with his free time in college? Would you ever guess fencing? I mean, putting on a suit and, sword fighting. I mean, like, you would just never expect some of this stuff. And I find that so interesting. But it makes sense if you think about it. Again, he was not the most athletic person in the world. So fencing, I'm not trying to disrespect the fencers. It's a great art form. It's a great sport. It's a great form of exercise. But you look at Heinrich Himmler, what other sports or activities could he have realistically had a chance at being good at? So that's probably why he chose fencing. So this fencing team, it wasn't so much a team or a club, but it was an actual fraternity. So in order to become part of the fencing group, you had to join this fencing fraternity, which just kind of made sense. So Heinrich Himmler, he's part of this fraternity, and he's one of these really low-ranking, really new members. I mean, it's like his first semester, he's early in on college, and he tries running for an election within the fraternity itself, hoping that he's going to win. Now, this is one of those positions that is normally for people who have been in there for a couple of years, normally 3 or 4 years, right? Well, Himmler gets in there with this certain expectation that people are just going to love him and vote him in, and oh yeah, everybody's going to love me. And again, this goes back to this psychological issue that he has going on. He has the entire world of expectations. And then over and over again, he is going to face disappointment after disappointment. And it must have been really painful. Really, really painful. I mean, you just get your hopes up high over the moon. You're excited. You're enthusiastic. And then the world comes crashing down. That doesn't justify his actions later in life. But I think we can all stop for a moment and say that this must have been a tough thing to live with. Imagine how disappointing and how horrible it would be to feel complete and utter disappointment every single day with every single relationship, with every single group you join. Always facing that. Now, we can get into the whole question of why did he have these grand expectations in the first place? And we'll get into that more. But I'm going to guess that it has something to do with the way he was raised. It was bad enough that he went in once for a position he was not qualified for. But he's going to be ballsy enough to go in a second time and do it again. And then he reflects on the whole experience, writing in his diary, quote, "On the one hand, I was hurt that I wasn't elected, but on the other hand, it's very good. I've got more time. I haven't cultivated people, and so I'm not well liked. Why? Because friendly types make comments about me because of my fencing, and because I talk too much." So there's quite a bit of introspection and self-realization going on here. I mean, he acknowledges that he's the kind of person that talks too much. He's not the best fencer in the world, but he doesn't consider himself a friendly type. He doesn't consider himself a friendly type, which is just weird, right? Because you think someone that's a talker is someone that's friendly. So you just have to imagine how he interacted in these social groups, in this fraternity. I mean, what does a talkative, unfriendly person look like? Right? This is something that I don't think I've personally known someone who was unfriendly and also very talkative. And then he's also like, yeah, well, my fencing isn't all that good either, so that's why I didn't get this position. But it's weird. It's just weird. He had the expectation that he could. I mean, he tried. He went out there and he tried. So some part of him believed that it was at least a possibility. And you think all that's bad? Let's just talk about Himmler and the ladies. Oh boy, was that a dumpster fire. Now, in his diary, he regularly wrote about being interested in women, in pursuing women, in having a relationship, being married one day. But he never actually pursued them. He never took that first step into asking a girl out, going out on a date. He didn't do any of that. He wanted to, at least some part of him wanted to, but he didn't go through with it. And then he had this one friend, right? And this one friend is named Alphonse Wolff. Alphonse Wolff had a girlfriend. He was a fairly popular guy. Him and Himmler, they hit it off. They were pals. They were buddies. So they become friends. Wolff has a girlfriend of his own. He's writing love letters back and forth with her. And then he allows Himmler to read letters from his girlfriend. So Wolff's girlfriend writes Wolff a love letter expressing deep affection and desire and, all kinds of stuff that goes in a love letter. And then he lets Heinrich Himmler read these letters. It's just kind of weird. A love letter is something that's really intimate, something that's really personal. And I don't know. Maybe I'm the weird guy in this situation. I personally find the whole idea of letting one of your bro dudes read your love letters from your girlfriend kind of strange. That's just kind of strange. So Himmler would read these love letters from Wolff's girlfriend addressed to Wolff, and then he would go home and think about it and write in his diary things like this, quote, "I find it interesting from a psychological point of view. One ought to get to know these kinds of people too." This is so strange. This is just one of those, what does he mean by these kinds of people too? Does he mean women? Does he mean people that are in relationships? I'm not sure exactly what he means by this, but it's just very interesting that he could have a relationship, a friendship with a guy like Wolff, read these letters, and then try to justify it. Oh yeah, it's not because I'm a weird creep. That's not why I'm reading my friend's love letters from his girlfriend. It's because I find it interesting it's psychological. It's from a psychological point of view. You see, that's why I'm doing it. I'm just trying to understand psychology. I mean, the reason I was peeping in the neighbor's window the other day, I wasn't creeping on her. I wasn't trying to, catch her doing something naughty. Can't see her naked or anything. I was interested in the human body. You see, I was just trying to study anatomy. You see, that's the real reason. I wasn't being a creep. It's for science. Oh, but you thought that was weird. It gets weirder. A lot weirder. Because Wolff lets Himmler start writing the replies to his girlfriend. So Himmler, who has no girlfriend, is writing love letters to Wolff's girlfriend addressed like they were from Wolff. So this is just weird, man. Hey bro, could you write my love letters to my girlfriend? She won't know the difference, that, silly girl. What? This is just so weird. And the thing I find myself wondering a lot is, who initiated this whole thing? Was it Wolff or was it Himmler? Because if it was Wolff, you know what? Maybe it was him. Maybe he was just this weird dude who didn't really care about his girlfriend that much. And he was like, hey, Himmler, you want to write these love letters for me? I mean, I don't really care enough about this girl to do it myself. So here you go, man. Have a whack at it. Or was it Himmler? Was Himmler just this really weird guy that was desperate for some kind of relationship with a girl, and this was the closest he could get to the real thing? You really have to wonder about that, because I don't think Wolff was the one that started this whole thing. I think that Himmler, he was the one that really wanted to do this. I mean, he was going back already and justifying it in his diary that he's, studying this from a psychological point of view. I'm sure he was just writing love letters to Wolff's girlfriend from a psychological point of view as well. Or maybe he was improving his writing abilities, or, getting ready to write love letters to the girl who would be his girlfriend one day. Who knows? Who knows what his justification or intentions were with what was going on here? All that we know is that, yeah, it's pretty weird. Pretty weird. I think Himmler's moral compass was very fitting for the times because, you see, he kind of had this whole idea, this whole concept of abstinence. You never did anything sexual until you had the woman that you knew for sure was definitely going to be your wife. Then you made her your wife, and then you started having kids. And that was the way sexuality was supposed to be handled. And he's not alone in having this whole outlook and this whole philosophy. In fact, I think it actually goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, when sexuality was almost viewed as a bad thing. And in a lot of ways, he was very much considering himself someone that's right on the edge of about to figure out what he's going to do with his life. Is he going to be some kind of a traveler? Is he going to be some kind of, government bureaucrat? Is he going to go into the military? What's he going to do? He has no idea. He's still very much in this deciding phase. So he doesn't really want to commit himself to a woman before he knows what he's going to be doing with his life. One of the things you probably would not expect to find in the diaries of Heinrich Himmler would be a bunch of rambling and banter about the virtue of abstinence. But that's exactly what you find on a lot of pages, writing stuff like this, quote, "Let us trample our animal nature underfoot, and with senses under control, seek the friendship of such women. They will not withhold it, and it will enrich our personal lives. It will restore to us in a purer form what we offered up, and if we were pure, it will immerse us in greater purity. It will increase our strength in our battle with ourselves, and we will be dubbed knights, pledged our whole lives to protect women, until we have found the woman to whom we wish to belong for life. Friendly relations with women are positively necessary." Basically, be this great guy, avoid anything sexual, be friends with as many women as you can, and then find one and settle down with her. Pretty straightforward outlook on it. For someone who wrote so much about the importance and necessity of having female friends, Himmler didn't have very many female friends. And as you might expect, he became gradually more and more envious of the guys in his friend group that went off and got married, that settled down. He wrote stuff like this on a number of occasions, quote, "Another of our group of 2 years ago has gone. Commitment to a woman forms a powerful bond, for thou shalt leave father and mother and cleave to thy wife. I am glad that once again 2 people so close to me have found happiness, but for me, struggle." And you can definitely feel, he's not overt about it. He's not like, man, I wish that was me. But on if you really read into it, on some level, he probably does feel a little envious about it. He probably wishes that it was him. And I will give credit where credit is due. Himmler is not overtly envious of his friends who find success with women. He's very much like, yeah, that's really good for him. I wish that was me. That's just kind of the way he frames it. And it's kind of hard to see too much bitterness in a writing like this, because there are quite a few passages like this throughout his diary. Now, it's right around this time in Himmler's life that he develops this attachment disorder to a point that he can't undo it. It gets so severe that it's going to be something that plays a major role in his life, in all of his relationships, sexual relationships, work relationships, everything. It is going to control everything in his life going forward. And there is not anything he can really do to stop it. And it kind of happened like this, right? So he would show these feelings of inferiority, and they would be provoked by repeatedly not getting the emotional support that he desired from other people. Not getting that emotional support was something that he suffered with as a child, right? We don't know what he thought about his relationship with his father or his mother or even his siblings. But they were not good enough that Himmler got this emotional support in a healthy capacity. He just never had this healthy amount of emotional support. And tell you the truth, he really strikes me as a sensitive guy. Now, I remember back in the day, I was researching a true crime. It was someone that went on this horrible massacre. He killed a bunch of sorority girls, and it was like for seemingly no reason, or at least no good reason. But then you start to look into the guy's writings, look into his mind. How did he reason himself to being able to justify a massacre in a college sorority, right? Like, how do you get there? How does someone get themselves there? And then you start reading his writings and you see, oh, this was a really sensitive guy. Someone that couldn't take criticism very well. Someone that couldn't handle rejection. Someone that didn't have present parental figures. It was just this horrible tragedy that was psychological torture for this kid. And as he grew up and as he became an adult, he just harbored all of these feelings of hatred and resentment and rejection that eventually brought him to committing an actual massacre. Right? I mean, that's just the worst possible thing. The massacre itself is horrible, and we should, hold these people responsible for what they do. But just imagine how many ugly emotions you have to feel in order to bring yourself to commit some kind of a massacre. Those are the questions that we really need to be asking. How bad do you have to feel about yourself that you can bring yourself to kill people? Innocent people who don't even know you. This guy in particular shares a lot of similarities with Himmler. Not that athletic. Kind of rejected. Not valued by society. Someone that's just kind of tossed aside. No good parental figures. This is something that's going to be a theme in the lives of serial killers, genocidal dictators, all of them. So many people that are, we consider the bad guys. These are really just emotional, sensitive people that get stomped on and crushed by the realities of life. And then they end up becoming horrible people in the long run. I don't think Himmler was born a bad person. I think that a really bad upbringing, a really bad abusive father, and then you have that on top of the circumstances of post-World War I Germany, and then you have the potential to create someone like Heinrich Himmler. Does not happen by accident. It was not like, one day Himmler was just this really great guy and then he became the Reichsfuhrer SS. It didn't happen like that. Does not happen with the blink of an eye. This is the psychological torture of an individual human being over and over again, every day after day. And it goes on for long enough that someone that was this sensitive kid becomes this horrible monster. Someone capable of becoming the architect of the Holocaust. And as much as we can and should hold him responsible for the atrocities that he committed, I also think it's important to acknowledge his humanity. Because this guy, Himmler, he was a human being too. And I don't think he was intrinsically motivated to do this, to do any of it, any of World War II or the persecution against minorities or any of the genocides. He wasn't born to do this. And I think it's really sad that someone who could have been an otherwise good person had to go down this route of misery and torture. And this inferiority complex that he's developing, this need for approval from his superiors, this is going to play a big, big role in his relationship with Hitler. And what you're also going to notice about Hitler's inner circle is that they're all just like Himmler. All of them. These are all men who need the approval of their superiors. They need it like a child needs approval from their father. Because that's what Hitler was. He wasn't just the Führer. He was their father. on some level. Now, at this phase in his life, Himmler's not actually all that anti-Semitic. He's what I would call a casual anti-Semite. He's not someone who's calling for a genocide. He's not someone that even wants to randomly hurt Jews. He's just someone that says, you know what? These people, collectively, they're doing something together, at least some of them. That doesn't mean that we should beat up, Shlomo down the street for no reason. Let's forget about that. Let's reject and denounce that kind of behavior. But these Jews, some of them are up to something. And those are the kind of thoughts that he had, and those are the kind of thoughts that a lot of people in Germany at this time were having. And again, it all goes back to that stab in the back narrative. Especially because you had all of these, big names in your society really starting to say, yeah, maybe there's some truth to this. And what you'll notice about a lot of these guys, a lot of these big Nazis who were responsible or played a major role in the Holocaust, a lot of them had Jewish friends and acquaintances, or their teacher was Jewish, or their professor was Jewish, or there were just so many instances. Sometimes they were Jewish themselves. Alfred Rosenberg we were talking about earlier. He was half Jewish. A lot of these guys had some kind of connection to Judaism. Things all start going bad when Himmler becomes friends with Ernst Röhm. You see, Ernst Röhm was very extreme from the very beginning. From day one, he was just this radical, right-wing, paramilitary guy that wanted to overthrow the government and establish some kind of new right-wing dictatorship. He was like a Nazi even before Hitler. So in a lot of ways, this was the beginning of the end for Himmler, because he eventually goes down this rabbit hole because of Röhm. And it all starts when he joins this Imperial War Flag Society. The German word is die Reichskriegsflagge. I'm going to apologize for that. I know my German pronunciation is not the best. This is one of those organizations that exist before the Nazi Party, because there were just so many organizations like this. There were so many people that were extreme nationalists, that were monarchists, that were very militaristic, and they just wanted to be part of something. They needed some kind of cause to die for, so that they wanted an organization to join, to serve, to fight for. Because now with the absolute monarchy being dissolved, what is there? There's just this liberal democratic German state, ruled by people that you probably think are your enemies. So you as a German citizen, you're going to be like, well, I guess I'll join some kind of paramilitary group. And Ernst Röhm and Himmler were some of the early guys in on at least this organization. And again, there were many others. And I think a really good way to think about it is, that game Agario, right? Where it's like you're a dot and then you eat someone else that's a smaller dot, you get a little bit bigger. That's kind of the way the Nazi Party grew. Whether it was with the SS or the SA or, the Nazi Party itself, they just absorbed anyone that was smaller than them. And the Imperial War Flag Society is just one of many of those smaller blobs that gets absorbed into what becomes the giant Nazi Party. So these guys, they get together, they do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like they demonstrate against the Treaty of Versailles, they riot, they protest, they do everything that they can to, really try to secure German independence, to stop them from being occupied, all kinds of crazy stuff that was going on. And for Himmler at this time, he becomes closer with his father, despite his extreme negativity, despite his dad being this really negative person. He becomes closer and closer with him, like many other young Nazi men do. They look at their father, they idealize them, and they just kind of accept this idealistic version of their fathers. Not the real father, not the guy who's actually sitting across the table from you, who told you you're kind of worthless. Not that guy. It's this idealistic version that you've created in your own head. And I remember sitting down to research this episode and thinking, oh my God, Himmler's father is horrible. This guy is rude, impatient, condescending, judgmental. I mean, just every horrible thing you can think of is Himmler's dad, Rex. And then you just think, well, it was probably really hard to have an actual relationship with this man. So you can understand why Himmler, he kind of created this fictional father in his own mind, in his own brain. There was a different father. Because that was probably a lot easier to deal with than the guy who was actually sitting across from him, judging him. And oddly enough, on some political issues, they kind of agree. They're on the same page. They have the same outlook. Now, we're going to take a little bit of a detour here because I think it's really, really important to understand how the German government treated World War I. Because one of the big things that they did, right? One big thing that they did that really set them up for failure down the road was that they used credit to fund the war activities. You never use credit to fund your war. It is a bad plan, it is a bad strategy, and you're just kind of assuming that you're gonna win. And that's really the way the German government treated it. They were like, listen man, we are not fighting a war on credit. We are making an investment in the future. There's no way we're gonna lose. No way we're gonna lose. They operated with this complete assumption that they were going to win this war, it was going to be an easy win, and there were going to be no problems. They weren't taking a bet. They weren't making a gamble. They were making an investment in future generations. They believed that they were going to win this war, and future generations were going to look back on them and say, wow, what a great generation of German citizens. Thank God for them. They're what great guys. But as we all know, that's not how it happened, because Germany lost. And this is rule number 1 of investing. You don't put all of your eggs in one basket, especially a basket that might get taken away. And that is exactly what the German government did. And they didn't just set themselves up for complete catastrophe. They set up every individual person living in the nation. Every single German citizen suffered because of these stupid decisions made by the government. Now, what else did the German government do that destined them for failure at this time? Well, they also took the Reichsmark off of the gold standard. So people always talk about the US dollar on the gold standard and not being backed up by anything, right? People always talk about this stuff, but what does it actually mean? What value does it bring to your currency to have it backed by gold? Well, let's take a step back for a moment. So if your currency is backed up by gold, it means that for every single US dollar or Reichsmark or whatever you have, for every single piece of currency, there is an equal amount of gold somewhere. That means that you're really just trading gold. This paper that you're trading around, that's just really a representation for gold. That's how it was supposed to be. Everyone agrees that gold is valuable. Everyone wants some. So by attaching your paper currency to gold, you guarantee that your currency is going to have value. It's not just paper. Now, the problem comes when you come off of that gold standard, because what does your currency even mean at that point? What is preventing, someone from sitting down, getting a printing press, printing a gazillion dollars for themselves, and, well, they're rich now. Well, what do you know? But now that there's all this additional currency, it brings down the value of the currency itself. I mean, at a certain point, you have so much of the paper currency that no one wants it. It doesn't have any value anymore. And this is really one of the big things that Germany did. that totally, it was a complete catastrophe, a complete failure. You have to wonder, right? Would the Nazi Party have come to power if the German government made a couple better decisions going into this war? Maybe they didn't fund the entire war with credit. Maybe they didn't come away from the gold standard. You really have to wonder. Maybe it wouldn't have been that bad. But they did make all of these horrible decisions. And millions of people had to pay the price later on down the road. So you have all of these horrible things going on with the war. People are coming back with PTSD. People are coming back with injuries. There are some men that aren't coming back from this war. They're dead. And now there are families that don't have a father. Some families don't have sons. So there's that problem. Then you have the problem of having lost the war. Now Germany has to pay all of this war debt because they were held solely responsible for the entirety of World War I. So all of the losses that France, UK, Russia, Britain, all of the losses that all of these countries suffered, that was now the burden of Germany to pay back. So you have that. You couple that with the fact that the German government made all these bad decisions prior to the war, right? Funding the war with credit, coming off the gold standard. And then you have a real recipe for disaster. It's no wonder things got as bad as they did. How could they not? How could they not? Himmler and his family, they weren't in some kind of unique position. They were just like every other German citizen that now had to face the wrath of reality. His family went from being this professional working class, upper middle class, right? They had a connection to the aristocracy, all this stuff. Well, now their connection to the aristocracy is dead. Money has lost all its value, and the family becomes impoverished. I really want you to think about what this actually means. This is a family that is 1 or 2 steps away from being elites themselves. Really well off, they had good jobs, they had a really secure position in society. And this hyperinflation, this loss of a war, impoverishes the entire family. And if that's what it did to this really upper middle class family, this really up there family in society, right? What does it do to everyone else? Those are the circumstances that the German people were living under after the war. It got so bad that sometimes the cost of living would just randomly double or triple out of nowhere in like a year. No one can live like that. That is chaos. That is absolute chaos you were living in. Just think about what would happen if your cost of living all of a sudden doubled in the course of like 1 year, and your job didn't pay you anymore. What happens then? Well, most people probably end up homeless. And let's not forget, there was a lot of that going on. I think a really useful tool is the cost of living index. And it's kind of a tool to give you a good understanding of how far your dollars go in a society. So in 1922, in Germany, the cost of living index was 41. That's a pretty good score, actually, very affordable to live. But by late 1922, it had risen all the way to 685. Just think about that for a minute. The cost of living index was not doubling or tripling. It was going up more than 10 times. More than 1,000%. Think about the impact that has on people. So just to give you a good modern comparison, let's look at New York City, one of the most expensive bourgeois cities on the planet. The cost of living index for New York City in 2020 is about 162. Compare that with 685. So the family just could not afford to educate all 3 of their kids. And now Himmler's in this really tough position where he has a lot of schooling under his belt. He spent a lot of money and everything else on school. He's been doing this for a couple years now. He doesn't have his degree, And now he doesn't have enough money from the family to continue his education, so he has to take this low-paying office job. And that's where the real animosity in people begins. Because you have this event, World War I, the stab in the back, all of this stuff going on. All of this happens. Your family is impoverished. You are forced to quit school. You can't afford to go anymore. You're taking this low-paying office job. It is only understandable that you are going to have real, deep, visceral hatred for whoever is responsible for making this happen, because you feel it on a personal level. At this time, Germany was really, really anti-Semitic, because, the whole stabbed in the back by the Jews thing, that took off really quickly. I mean, really fast. It was like right after the war that everyone was basically like, yeah, man, it was those Jews. They're the reason this all happened. Now, Himmler at this point, as anti-Semitic as he was, he still opposed random violence against the Jews. So he still had some bit of humanity in him, I guess, some bit of morality. But it wasn't very much. But it was in the summer of 1922 that he became completely politicized. By this point, he is openly hostile to the left and very sympathetic to the radical, militant right. So during the interwar period, there was a man. His name was Walter Rathenau, and he was the German foreign minister during the Weimar Republic. And he is one of these figures that had a lot of attacks coming his way, not just as a politician, but also as a human being. So not only was he ethnically Jewish, he was also politically liberal. And then he played a big role in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So if you're a far right-wing militant person, propagandist, this kind of person is your bread and butter. He's the kind of person that you don't stop talking about because he fits all the narratives. He's Jewish, he's part of the government, he's a liberal, he's anti-monarchy. He is all the things that the right-wing propagandists need to win over the public. Now, don't get me wrong, there were plenty of people who were involved in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. Like, it wasn't just this one guy. There were a lot of people involved. But the attacks stuck with him personally because he was Jewish. That played a big role. You see, the argument went something like this. This guy isn't a German, he's a Jew. He doesn't have Germany's best interests at heart, and that's why he was able to sign the worst possible treaty that basically screwed over our nation. The argument went something like that, and it really resonated with a lot of people. Again, people were angry. People were disappointed. And people like Walter Rathenau just became the easiest targets. And I think this event marks a significant change in Himmler's thinking. Because as it happens, after it happens, he sees the assassination as being justified. He doesn't have any problems with assassinating someone for their, whatever political opinion someone may have. I think us in the 21st century should be able to say, you know what? I might disagree with you. I might think you're an idiot. But you should not be assassinated for what you're doing. But that's not what Himmler was thinking. He was thinking that this guy was an enemy, and his assassination was not just a good thing. But if you try to make Rathenau out to be a martyr, if you try to memorialize him, you're an enemy. You see, because you're making an attempt to turn this enemy into a martyr. And I would really make the case that this is the point where Himmler is basically lost to the far right. He is no longer someone that can really see reality and political situations for what they really are. This is someone who is possessed by an ideology. I mean, when you start despising people who attempt to memorialize an assassinated politician, I mean, no matter how bad they may have been. I mean, Walter Rathenau may have been maybe he really was someone that just didn't really care about Germany. Maybe there was some kind of under-the-table agreement, like he got personally rich for signing it. Who knows? Even if that is the case, when you celebrate someone's murder, you have crossed a line. You have crossed a line. And it's something that's really hard to come back from. Himmler wrote about the incident saying, quote, "Rathenau's been shot. I'm glad. Uncle Ernst is too. He was a scoundrel, but an able one. Otherwise, we would never have got rid of him. I'm convinced that what he didn't do for Germany." And I really think on some level, he believes or he knows that he's in the wrong here. That celebrating the death of someone else, no matter who they are, is wrong. Because he has to point out, oh yeah, well, my uncle's happy about it too. I mean, this is his personal diary. Why would he have to, back it up with some kind of social proof? I don't understand why else he would even be writing that. When you need to justify your actions by saying, oh, well, a bunch of other people, you see, they're doing it too. Me and all my friends, we're all jumping off bridges, so it's just going to be a grand old time. Well, when you need that social proof to be able to justify what it is you're doing, I think on some level you know that what you're doing is wrong. And I think that's what's going on here. And it's really sad too, because in a lot of ways, this is someone that has kind of fallen victim to political extremism. Not so much someone that, just randomly decides to become some kind of extremist or mass murderer. This may not come as a surprise to you, but Heinrich Himmler is someone that a lot of people have spent a lot of time studying, getting inside of his mind, trying to find what made him tick. And in the world of people who have studied Himmler, there has been a narrative about his life that has kind of emerged. And it goes something like this. Heinrich Himmler was rebelling against his father. Now, he was ultimately deep down right-wing himself. So he couldn't support the communists, the socialists, the traitors. But instead what he did was he went along with these right-wing revolutionaries, the Nazis, as an act of rebellion against his father. And that it was a big splitting off. That his father kind of represented the old school conservative way of doing things in Germany. Now, don't get me wrong, they were very authoritarian, very theological and heavy-handed, and censorship and all the other stuff that was associated with the old politics of that time. But Himmler was coming away from that, at least in the traditional sense. But I'm going to make the case that this is not what happened. I always love reminding people of a small footnote in history that really sets the scene for this time. And that's that in Bavaria, there was a Soviet Socialist Republic installed. They were living under communism for a short period of time. And that plays a big, big role in spawning this whole far-right movement that's eventually going to control the entire nation. It's not a coincidence that the Nazis came out of Bavaria. And it's because they were living under, all the horrors of communism. And what happens is, when you live under one political regime, you just swing to the opposite side. So if you are living under heavy-handed socialist authoritarianism, well, you're just going to swing to the far right and you're going to become, basically a Nazi. Basically the same thing, except instead of being far left, you're now far right. And you see yourself as diametrically opposed to this existing regime. And Heinrich Himmler, his father, a bunch of the early Nazis, and all of these other guys that are in these far-right groups, whether they were nationalist or pro-military or, what have you, the reason they were able to garner so much influence is because they were living under a communist regime. It is so easy to become an anti-communist when you live under communism. So easy. The same way, it's very easy to become an anti-fascist when you live under fascism. And we just don't know a whole lot about Himmler's dad. Maybe he was a Nazi sympathizer at a certain point. I mean, we just don't know. We don't have those documents. Or maybe he would have been if he had been in the right circumstances. Maybe he just hadn't been exposed to that thinking. Himmler was not fundamentally breaking with his dad politically. He was co-opting his negativity, his shadow, and he was going to use it in a new political way. So one of the resources I used to create this episode was Peter Longerich's biography of Heinrich Himmler. And he takes the view that this is not Himmler's rebellion. It is an extension. It is something of Himmler's way of adopting and expanding upon his father's cruelty. And in a lot of ways, this is coming away from the traditional thinking of Himmler. Because it's really easy to try to get wrapped up in this whole idea that the Nazis were just one-off things and, they only happened by an accident. That was the real reason the Nazis were there. It's much easier to distance yourself from Nazism and political extremism. And I really want you to ponder this question. Was Himmler's political rebellion against his father actually what was going on here? Did he really break away from who his father was politically and personally? Now, I just want to be 100% clear. I'm not saying this definitively. I'm just saying this is my opinion. This is Peter Longerich's opinion. But you can make up your mind for yourself. Maybe you really do believe that Himmler was rebelling against his father, against traditional society, because you really can make that case. Himmler is going to be very anti-Christian. He's going to be, against a lot of things that were bedrocks of German society before Nazism. He's going to break away from a lot of stuff. I mean, the monarchy. That's something they do away with. The old aristocracy. And then, of course, the big one, Christianity. They really try forging a new way. And that is something you can make the argument. You can view it as a rebellion. But in my humble opinion, that would be giving Himmler and the Nazis far too much credit. They were not that original. They were not really creating this new whole society. They were really taking what worked and putting it back in place. Really, that's what they were doing. The big change in society that they made was getting rid of democracy. That's pretty much it. Installing a military dictatorship. It was not fundamentally new. And I really do think that when you frame it as a rebellion or something that is just this crazy new revolutionary movement, you create distance between yourself and the Third Reich and the Nazis. And I think people find a little bit of comfort in that. So I understand why there is so much done to be like, oh, well, they were just insane and they were all on meth and they were just completely new in their thinking. Like, no, these people were just human beings with bad moral compasses and a few political ideas taken to their absolute extreme, right? Reductio ad absurdum. That's really what Nazism was. That's what the Third Reich was. They were not new, crazy, innovative thinkers. And I think you're giving them way too much credit when you try to frame them in that light. Himmler officially joined the NSDAP, or the Nazi Party, in August of 1923. He was member 14,303, and no, they did not actually have that number of people. They actually started at I think 500 or so, just to make it appear as if they had more members than there actually were. So, the first 25 or so people it would be 501, 502. They would just start out at that number. It was kind of pragmatic, actually. And it really, I think, played a role in starting the party's early success. There are very few people who are in the Nazi Party for the long run that can say they were involved in the beer hall putsch in November of 1923. This was the Nazi Party's attempt to overthrow the government in Munich. It was their attempt to really jumpstart the whole Nazi dictatorship thing. Partly taken from inspiration from the revolution in Russia, the revolution in Italy, the fascist revolution in Italy, and they were just kind of hoping that they could take over power in Munich, then Bavaria, and then just spread across the rest of Germany. That was the plan. Didn't quite work out that way because many of the people in the government in Munich were right-wing conservatives. And there was still this big wall between the radical right and the conservative right. When you really boil it down, the conservatives and the fascists, they don't have that much in common. They don't agree on a lot of stuff. In fact, the far right and the far left have a heck of a lot more in common than the far right and the moderate right. So there was this instantaneous collision between the two, and the conservative right, they sided with the existing government. They just wanted to make do with what they could and hopefully improve the situation in the nation. They didn't want to overthrow the government. They didn't want to start a new society. They didn't want a revolution. They didn't want to do it violently. But then France started occupying the Ruhr. And the Ruhr is a very economically prosperous part of Germany. And it was because there were all these delayed payments by Germany for this war debt that they owed to France. And it was a really tricky situation. Again, it goes back to, they were using credit to fund the war effort. They just did a whole bunch of horrible financial decisions. They were susceptible to hyperinflation. Again, that was going on in 1922 especially. So their currency just had no value. I mean, almost no value by this point. And when they tried to make these payments, it just wasn't enough. Like, the government literally did not have enough money to make these payments. So France just said, listen, man, we're going to come in. We're just going to start taking stuff. And there was an international reaction of, oh, wow, France is not playing around with getting their interest payments. Now, the last Biocast episode I did was on Leon Trotsky, who was a Russian communist, and even he observed how horrible an event this was for Germany. And I don't remember exactly what he said, so don't quote me, but Trotsky said something to the effect of, wow, France is playing Russian roulette with international politics in Germany because they're worried about their interest payments. They're more worried about their interest payments from Germany than international peace. And it wasn't just a risky move in the moment. I think by occupying the Ruhr and just going in and taking things from German citizens, I think France really sowed the seeds of hatred in the eyes of a lot of Germans. Because now the only thing they're going to want to do is get revenge for this horrible event. And I really want to ask you, you personally, listening to this right now, can you blame them? Your most antagonistic enemy, your arch nemesis throughout history, comes in after they just beat you in a war, gave you these horrible reparation payments you have to pay, horrible treaties that you were forced to sign, and they're going to come into your country, take stuff away from your citizens, your brothers and sisters, and they're going to laugh while they do it. Can you blame the German citizens for wanting revenge? Now, you can blame the Third Reich for a lot of horrible stuff, but I think France really had their invasion coming. Really had it coming. Because it's stuff like this. Stuff like this really sows the seed of hatred. Now, this occupation by France goes all the way back to 1919. Now, the interesting thing is that they stationed between 25,000 and 40,000 colonial troops on the Rhine. And people seem to be under the impression that fake news is something that was created with the internet. It was not. It was going on during this time. And the fake news in Germany was that there were a whole bunch of war crimes and atrocities and genocides going on against German civilians by France and their colonial troops. There were cases of rape, assault, mutilation, and it got so bad that the US had to get involved to investigate what was going on. So America sent over General Henry Allen, and he reported that there were 66 such incidents and there were many unreported incidents as well. So it was definitely happening, definitely going on, definitely a problem. I mean, anything more than one is horrible. These are innocent civilians being attacked, raped, or assaulted or mutilated by foreign troops during an alleged time of peace. Horrible thing to happen, but it wasn't thousands, like the fake news in Germany was claiming. They made it out like there were thousands and thousands, and it was everywhere you went, everywhere you looked. This horrible stuff was going on. Wasn't actually the case. And the reason it was important to mention that it was the colonial French troops in there is because the colonial French troops were not Europeans. A lot of them were Africans. People love talking about the British Empire and all of their colonies, but we tend to forget that France had quite a few colonies herself. And during this interwar period, they were sending in a whole bunch of French troops into German territory to occupy their land. And that's who the allegations were against. Not ethnically European French military personnel, but against these Africans who were under the French flag in German territory. So you can really see why the far-right propagandists in Germany were exaggerating and talking about these incidents so much. These were people that were not European who were coming into Germany, raping and assaulting and mutilating German citizens. And even the United States came in and confirmed that there were at least 66 incidents. It at least happened 66 times. And that was seen as a national humiliation, an unjust, undeserved punishment against Germany and German citizens. It got so bad that there was an actual phrase that became fairly popular in Germany at the time, Die schwarze Schmach, roughly translated as the black shame. And then these African German children that were the result of these rapes that went on, they were referred to as the Rhineland bastards. And there were quite a few of them. Yes, this was seen as a national disgrace, a complete humiliation, an unjust punishment. But it is a golden nugget for right-wing propagandists because they can now take this and they can say, look at what France is doing to you. They're sending in Africans. And the prevailing opinion of Africa at the time was that they were subhumans. This is not some new idea that gets spawned with the Nazis. I mean, even France and Great Britain kind of viewed Africans as not quite people. So you can understand why there were so many angry Germans that they were sending in these subhumans to attack and to occupy and to rape German civilians. And looking back, you almost have to wonder, was France trying to cause a right-wing backlash in Germany? Because if there was some kind of playbook, right? If you had some kind of playbook, some kind of set of rules or a plan to spawn some kind of right-wing revolution in a country, this is like point number one. This is what you do. You give them a piece of propaganda that has some truth to it, right? Because they're going to exaggerate it. They're going to be very hyperbolic and sensational with it. That's definitely going to happen. But you give them a talking point like this. You let them run with it. And sooner or later, you're going to find quite a few German citizens sympathizing with the far right. Because when you see stuff like this going on, even if there's only 66 incidents, you can't help but turn a lot of people into a far-right sympathizer. And people seem to always be wondering why the Nazis were so obsessed with race. Stuff like this is why. Stuff like this is why. And the national politics in Germany at the time were pretty complex, were kind of interesting. So it wasn't just Bavaria that had been a communist state. It was also Thuringia and Saxony. They were socialist republics. And they were not just socialist republics. They were becoming more and more comfortable collaborating with open communists. The Beer Hall Putsch, the Nazis' attempt to seize power, completely fails. Doesn't work at all. The conservatives protect the government, and the Nazis, most of them get sent to prison. Some of them are killed. And that leaves Heinrich Himmler unemployed and now so politically radical that some of his friends stop associating with him. Now, if you're an American, I'm sure you've lived through at least one instance where people became overly politicized. Everything is politics, and there are some people that all they seem to do is talk about politics. They're just, regurgitating talking points from their favorite news station all the time. They're always sharing stuff on social media. Just always constant outrage at their opposition. That is basically what Himmler was at this point. That kind of person. Someone that is always outraged, always talking about politics. It's the only thing they think about, the only thing they talk about. And you can understand why his friends don't want to be around him anymore. It's really difficult to be friends with those people. This is the point in Himmler's life when he could have walked away. He could have said, you know what, this far-right propaganda thing, it was fun while it lasted. I got in shape while I was in the paramilitary groups. I had some interesting experiences, but I'm going to put myself first. I'm going to go make something of myself somewhere else. I'm going to go get a job. I'm going to lick my wounds and move on. And instead of doing that, he moves back in with his parents, and he becomes a political agitator. And now all he's doing is spreading Nazi propaganda all the time, 24/7. That is now basically his job. It's the only thing he does. He becomes something of a newspaper writer as well. He wrote articles with this uniquely strong nationalist tone. They sounded kind of something like this. Quote, "A German poet once said, 'He who does not put his life on the line will never gain his life.' Nowadays, people in Germany think that one can speculate for one's life with currency and shares, but the day will come when the Reich that Bismarck cemented together with blood and iron and is now falling apart through money will be revived once more with blood and iron, and that's when we'll come into our own." And I thought this was a really good quote because it gives you so much information on his political viewpoints right here at this time. So the only way to live life is to give your life to Germany. That's the only purpose your life has, serving your nation state. It's above everything. That's how you live. And then he's also very anti-capitalist. He's talking against currency and shares, and you see, that's what's destroying Germany. It's not all these other horrible circumstances that just kind of happen after, losing a war. That's not why things are bad. It's because of currency and shares and people thinking that's going to hold anything together. And then he's also harking back to Bismarck's Reich. And I think this is something worth discussing with the way right-wing revolutionaries frame things. Because it's really strange. So left-wingers, right? The left is generally associated with change, progressivism, bringing more rights to the people, ensuring workers' rights. I mean, that's basically what the left is all about. Even in its most extreme form, communism, they're still fighting for the workers, right? I mean, Karl Marx ends the Communist Manifesto with "Workers of the world, unite." So the left kind of has a framework to work with. They have a bad guy, they have what they're going to do about it, a problem that they're going to solve. The way right-wing revolutionaries frame things is always interesting. Because they always have to hark back to the past, the glory days, when things were just so much better than they were now. Of course, we now know with our modern eyes that generally this is people idealizing a past that never really existed. But there's also another important element to the right-wing revolutionary framework. And that's that we had this great past, we're in a degenerate time now, and we need a rebirth. We need something new to happen. We need to shed this degeneracy and bring about the new golden age. We need to bring back Bismarck's Reich. We need to go back to those good old times when everything was fine and dandy. That is a very important element to not just German right-wing revolutionaries, but right-wing revolutionaries anywhere. Internationally. If you look at a right-wing revolutionary in the United States, generally that's going to be how they frame things. Oh, things were so much better during, the 1700s or the 1800s or, whenever it was. They're always harking back to this past that probably didn't exist. And they want to go back to this time by having this rebirth, by restructuring society and cleansing the country of the ills and the sins and everything else. That is going to be a key component in every right-wing revolutionary, and it is especially present with Himmler's thinking and the thinking of many of the Nazis. It is really difficult getting an understanding of how horrible someone was to be around, their personality, how overbearing they really were. It's a really difficult task to get a feel for that. But thankfully, we have this little story from Himmler's brother. You see, his brother's name was Gebhard, and he had become engaged to a woman named Paula. So Gebhard and Paula, they get into an argument over Paula being a little bit too friendly with another man. He gets a little jealous. He thinks that maybe his wife has feelings for this other guy, who knows? Well, Gebhard has the good idea to get Heinrich Himmler involved, to intervene as an intermediary, to try to come in and be the objective judge on what's really going on in this situation. So Himmler gets involved, and he basically tells Paula if her husband even feels like she's being dishonest or a little bit too friendly with other men, then she has failed as a wife. And then he tells her that she must be kept on a tight rein with barbaric strictness. Just think about that, right? Imagine being in Paula's shoes and Heinrich Himmler gets involved and then says that you need to be kept on a tight rein with barbaric strictness. And then he has this weird feeling that he wants to personally get involved and kind of keep Paula under control. Well, as you might imagine, Paula politely tells Himmler to mind his own business and that this is not how to solve this problem. But I think this is another one of these stories that really illustrates how weird Heinrich Himmler really was. Think back to that Alphonse Wolff story where he was reading his friends' love letters to his girlfriend and then writing responses. It's just weird stuff. And then you get this, where his brother's wife is a little bit too flirtatious or a little bit too friendly with another man. And then he comes in and says, yeah, she needs to be kept on, a tight rein. She needs to be treated with barbaric strictness, pay attention to her all the time. Make sure she doesn't do anything. And listen, man, I'll come in. I'll do it for you. Like, what? That is the weirdest thing I have ever heard in my life. It would have been one thing if he had gotten involved and said, listen, Gebhard, your wife is a little too friendly with men over there. You need to keep a strict eye on her. Make sure she doesn't do anything, because she's definitely the kind of woman that would. It would have been one thing if that's where he left it. But he says that, and then he's like, listen, man, I'll come on in. I'll help you out. I'll watch your wife for you while you're out. Like, what? I just seriously want you to think about what a disturbed man this guy really was. On a serious note, maybe it was spawned out of this desperation for womanly affection. Maybe he would have been okay if the only affection or friendship of a woman he ever got was supervising his brother's wife, as weird as that may have been. And, it might sound horrible and desperate and kind of cringe, honestly, but just think about it. It might be true. Now, we can't verify that again. This is one of those things where we just don't really know for sure. But personally, I think it's a possibility. I think that could have been Himmler's thought process here. So now we can get into his politics, his career, and a little bit of his worldview. So he had been a radical right-wing militant activist for years and years by this point now. And in the year of 1923, he was desperately searching for a worldview. He wanted some kind of coherent lens that could view the world, that could interpret the world, and could basically make sense of things. Now, he eventually adopted this whole concept of Germanic paganism, racial superiority, a bunch of stuff like that. He abandons Catholicism altogether, and he focuses instead on this occult Germanic paganism, which is increasingly popular at this point. He's not the only guy in Germany during this time to be getting into Germanic paganism. It's making a big revival at this point. So Himmler had been reading this one book, and it was very anti-Semitic. It was kind of a conspiracy theorist book. It was basically one of those, oh, the Jews are taking over the world. They're trying to control every person on earth. One of those kinds of books. Now, he had read the book, and he had noted the author's paranoia. He identified, yeah, this guy's a little bit paranoid. I mean, he thinks a little bit too much of the Jews. But then he still accepts the author's arguments as true. And then he says something like this. He observes in his notes, quote, description of the Jewish system which is designed to condemn people to a moral death. It's conceivable that there's a persecution complex involved in all this to a certain degree. But the system undoubtedly exists and the Jews operate it. So he acknowledges that there is this persecution complex, that there's a little bit of paranoia going on. But then he's like, yeah, man, it definitely exists and the Jews are behind it. Like, I think when you find yourself in one of those positions when you read someone or you listen to someone and you're like, yeah, this guy's a little bit nutty, but he deep down, he's right. On some level, he's right. I think that's when you've kind of gotten into this realm of you're not looking for the truth. You're looking for information and material to back up your own insane worldview and your crazy theories. Because if he had really believed what the author was saying, he wouldn't have been saying that the guy has a persecution complex. He probably wouldn't have pointed that out. He wouldn't have pointed out the guy's paranoia. But he does. He's like, yeah, this guy's kind of a nut. Yeah, this guy's kind of a nut, but, he's fundamentally right. I mean, like, there is just something about doing mental gymnastics like that is so strange, but also very dangerous. Because when you can kind of justify things in your own head with your own logic and reasoning, you can really find yourself in these really horrible positions, right? I mean, look at what he's really saying here. There is some kind of horrible system in place designed to condemn people to a moral death, and the Jews operate it. And if someone like Himmler, someone that is eventually going to be one of the top dogs in the Nazi system, if he reads your book and says that you have a persecution complex, but still accepts what you say anyway, I mean, this is an author's book that's circulating all over the country. If Himmler can get his hands on it, there's probably quite a few people in Germany that can. And this underlines something very important, that Heinrich Himmler is willing to accept anything that furthers his own ideological agenda. If it furthers the cause of radical right-wing militancy, he's okay with it. And I always enjoy discussing the early Nazi Party because people kind of associate National Socialism as being strictly nationalistic in its tendencies. But people tend to forget that there is that socialist part, right? The National Socialist German Workers' Party. And Gregor Strasser was one of the big dogs of the left-wing faction or the socialist faction of the Nazis, especially in the early days. Now, he's going to get betrayed later down the road. But one thing that's really fascinating, is that Himmler worked under Strasser. In fact, a lot of the shared ideological connection between these two guys is based on an opposition to capitalism. Because you see, remember that quote I was reading earlier, about Himmler disliking capitalism because it uses money and shares to try to build a nation, and it fails, well, that is kind of a socialist idea. If you were a socialist, that is something you would use as evidence to say, listen, we're putting money first over the lives of people, over the well-being of children. That is something that's wrong, and that's something we should oppose. And this kind of thought process was very present within the Nazi Party. There were a lot of very left-wing socialists, and these two guys, Himmler and Strasser, got really close early in the 1920s because they were both spreading Nazism in Lower Bavaria. Now, if you look at Himmler's politics, you can definitely begin to see Strasser's influence. He definitely softened him up to the ideas of socialism. Just look at this excerpt from a speech he gave in 1926. Quote, "In the course of history, periods of capitalism and socialism alternate with one another. Capitalism is the unnatural, socialism the natural economic system." So as early as 1926, Himmler is very much in favor of socialism. He's very anti-capitalist. Why? Because capitalism puts money first. And this is, again, part of the reason the Nazis were able to draw from so many different segments of society. They were anti-capitalist. If you were someone that was kind of a socialist on some issues, someone that may have been attracted to Marxism and communism, you could very easily find yourself becoming a Nazi sympathizer because they have this one thing in common. They are anti-money, anti-capitalism, because they think that money, that's the least important part of society. We should not be focusing on that. And it was kind of dangerous to have these kinds of ideas, especially because, well, there was a lot of friction between Strasser and Hitler later on down the road. Strasser, he ends up dead. His brother ends up getting exiled, and that's the end of socialism in the Nazi Party. Himmler, he's more loyal to Hitler, though. He doesn't stand his ground. Again, he has this inferiority complex. He needs the approval of that father figure, of the Führer. So he's going to give in to Hitler whenever Hitler wants. But that does not mean he gives up on these socialist sympathies. He goes on in that same speech, saying, quote, "Capitalism has once again taken over the throne. Nowadays, people are no longer interested in whether someone's an honest chap, but just in how much money he has. People don't ask where the money has come from, but whether he's got it. Capitalism seizes control of machinery, the most noble invention of mankind, and uses it to enslave people. This causes people to long for freedom, and this longing for freedom expresses itself in the workers' class struggle." That sounds very socialistic. If you had put this in a different context, you probably would not think this was a Nazi writing this or saying this. It's very interesting. And I already know what you're thinking. If these guys are socialist sympathizers, why were they so opposed to left-wingers? Well, here's the thing. Many left-wingers became Marxists. And that is specifically the Marxist or communistic interpretation of socialism, of capitalism, of wealth in general. It was unique in that you weren't just a socialist anymore. You had come away from the general idea that the state should control some things, and you crossed into the realm of the state should control everything, all the industries. And here's the thing. The Nazis claimed Marxism was a Jewish subversion of socialism. So according to the Nazis, socialism, fundamentally good. But the Jews came along and they ruined it, and they created Marxism. And all these Marxist states you see, all these Marxist political parties, those are just socialists with good, well-meaning intentions that were subverted and tricked by the Jews. You see, that's why we have to go and kill them. I mean, it sounds a little nutty. Really is how these guys thought, though. Himmler's personal life goes along pretty fast. He meets Margaret Boden in 1927. They get married in 1928, and they have a daughter in 1929. Boom, 3 big life changes, 3 years. Boom, bada bing, you got a family. He actually adopts the son of a dead SS man, which is a little interesting. So Himmler had officially become the leader of the SS in 1929, this paramilitary organization. He had put in enough years of being this paramilitary guy that he was now the Reichsführer SS, top guy in control. And he was pretty good at it. He grew the organization from 290 members to over 3,000 in no time. But you see, here's the thing. Himmler is basically an office bureaucrat. He doesn't really do a whole lot on the ground. He was good at organizing things. He was good at delegating tasks to different departments and different segments within the organization. But as far as his day-to-day life, it was mostly paperwork and organization. It's really what he was, a glorified project manager. Himmler really lucked out because he became the Reichsführer SS in 1929, and just a couple of years later, Nazis established their rule in 1933. Very, very fortunate. And you see, the way they did it was brilliant. Now, don't get me wrong, it was evil, but it was very, very smart. It was like the evil genius way of doing things. Because what they did was they twisted laws and emergency decrees to become the dominant political force to weaken the Weimar Constitution. They did everything legally. The Third Reich, Adolf Hitler, the Nazi regime, all of it was legal. 100% legal. That's something I don't think a lot of people can even get their heads around. Because it was so bad. It was so horrible. It was literally a military dictatorship. How did they do this legally? Well, they took advantage of the laws and emergency decrees. And there were so many little things that they did. I mean, there was the fire decree. And then Hindenburg ended up giving up to Hitler's requests to pass certain laws. And there was just so much politicking going on behind the scenes. And it really gives the impression that the Nazis were really popular. And don't get me wrong, they were popular among certain segments of the population within Germany. But here's the thing. Here's the very important thing. They never got more than 34% of the vote. They never got to 50% support within Germany until after they started a military dictatorship. So that's important. That is really important. Because they are able to kind of secure their own legitimacy. Even though most people don't really care for their ideas, their policies, their plans for the future, they are able to go through it legally, and they have the appearance of legitimacy. It took a lot of planning to establish this new terrorist state, and Himmler was a key figure in making that happen. And we can get really into the details of exactly how, but another big important thing that they did was they basically replaced the police with the SS and the SA. They became the de facto police. They were no longer relying on the government police officers to keep the order. If you needed some kind of help, you went to the SS or the SA. And then they also created the Gestapo to target political opponents. And then now if the Gestapo's targeting you, you don't have any police officers you can really go to for help. Because who are they? Well, it's the SA and the SS. All of the important branches of the German government were now in the hands of the Nazi Party. And this was the beginning of the Holocaust, because they started rounding up political prisoners, people that were openly communist or Jews or socialists or anyone else, people that opposed the regime. They were sent to labor camps. And they really framed it in a genius way, because they could be like, listen, man, we don't want to put these guys in labor camps. They are a threat to our power. They might try to overthrow the government. I mean, we're in a bad enough situation as it is. We got to just round these people up and we'll worry about them another time. State by state, Himmler appointed Nazi sympathizers or personal associates of his to positions of police command. This is a major part of getting control of the entire nation. When you control the police force, law enforcement, you control everything. Because now they have the ability to choose which laws are going to be enforced and which laws were not. And of course, they concealed the entire thing, because if it's openly known that they're taking over law enforcement, well, people are going to oppose that. People are going to try to write a law against that, protest or riot or do something. But it was concealed. No one knew it was going on until it was way too late. And I don't remember exactly where I read this, but someone I read somewhere floated the idea that this was their way of using plausible deniability of organized state terror. Because if they could deny that they were taking over law enforcement, if they could deny that, well, they don't bear any real responsibility if something horrible happens down the road. And what that means is, like, if that's true, even to an extent, if it was a thought in the minds of Himmler or the other Nazi leaders, well, that means that they were planning a genocide long before they ever even got power. Because this move to take over law enforcement in Germany had been going on for a very long time. And there was particularly a lot of struggle in Prussia. Because you see, Prussia was where the capital was, Berlin. And Berlin was where the government was. So whoever controlled the law enforcement in Prussia controlled the government, and whoever controlled the government controlled the entire nation. That's a lot of power right there. So you can see why it was so crucial to get law enforcement under your thumb. And there were a lot of German citizens that were kind of hopeful about the Nazi leadership, the Nazi takeover, because in 1933, things were horrible. They were like, well, maybe these guys might be a little nutty, but maybe they can bring about some kind of change. I mean, at the very least, it can't get any worse, can it? And here's the thing about the Nazi takeover of 1933. A lot of Germans were suffering. They were still suffering the burdens of the loss of World War I, of hyperinflation, of debt, the global depression. I mean, economically, things were just the worst that they had ever been. Horrible. And the suffering was immense. Now, I actually knew someone who had lived in Germany during that time. Now, they were like a young girl at the time, but I talked to her quite a few times. I asked her a bunch of different questions on multiple occasions, and this was kind of her rundown of it. The German people were desperate for any hope of change that they could get, so they put their faith in Hitler, and at first, things were working out. Everything looked like it was gradually getting better, bit by bit. But that's only if you ignore the religious persecution, especially against Christianity, the persecution against the Jews, persecution against any minorities in any way, shape, or form. So the Nazis take over the government in 1933. And then 1 year later, they decide that they're going to purge the Nazi Party of anyone that they don't like. People who are not loyal to Hitler, the people that are more of the socialist kind of national socialists, people that lean a little bit to the left, and basically anyone that they deem a threat within the Nazi Party or the regime or the government, really anyone that stands in their way of power. Now, when this happens, there are a couple of people who are the big winners, and one of them is Heinrich Himmler. One of these people purged was Ernst Röhm, Himmler's early mentor, the guy that originally got Himmler involved in paramilitary affairs in the very beginning. You see, he was the leader of the SA. He was deemed a threat. He was someone that could not be trusted, someone that Hitler didn't really feel a whole lot of love for. So they just got rid of him. They killed him. And Himmler, for all of his faults, he could at least identify where the real power in the regime was. And that was with Hitler. Because this is not the only person that was a mentor to Himmler that gets betrayed during the Night of the Long Knives. Strasser, remember Strasser, who was basically Himmler's mentor when they were spreading Nazi propaganda in Lower Bavaria. He was another target. Him and his brother. One of them gets killed, the other one gets exiled. Himmler says nothing. In fact, he's part of the whole coup. It didn't matter that these guys had been close associates, had been friends, had been lifelong party members for, going back years and years. It didn't matter. None of it. What mattered was that they were now deemed a threat. So, sorry man, doesn't matter that you've been part of this whole movement for a decade. We're going to stab you in the back. And that was the Night of the Long Knives. Those were some of the people you probably would not have expected to have gotten the knife in the back. Now, there were also some other people purged within the government, the kind of people it's pretty obvious that it was coming. The conservatives who kind of drew a strong line, a big distinction between themselves and these Nazis. Then there were the anti-Nazi politicians, obviously they were purged. This is a cornerstone moment in the regime. It shows that it doesn't matter how long you've been with us. If we deem you a threat, you will get a knife in the back. Ernst Röhm had been a Nazi before Hitler. He was a Nazi before the Nazi Party existed. Didn't matter. Didn't save him. And then the other big thing is that it changed the party dynamics. Because there was no longer this kind of balancing act between socialist interests and nationalist interests. It's only now ruled by these radical right-wing thinkers, right? The nationalist side of the National Socialist Party. When Hitler got rid of Strasser, he didn't just get rid of the biggest socialist in the party. What he did was he made it clear, he gave a clear understanding to anyone else that people who were going to voice sympathies to Strasser or Strasserism or, the socialist left-leaning part of the Nazi Party, anyone in that camp, they were going to be targeted now. They had something to worry about. So you have quite a few of these guys. They understand what's going on, so they just start self-censoring themselves. They stop voicing their own opinions. They're scared for their lives because they don't want to end up dead or in exile. They worked just as hard to make all of this happen as Strasser did, as Hitler did, as Ernst Röhm did, and they don't want to end up dead. They want to reap the rewards for all the work that they've done. And if you really analyze it, this is exactly what Stalin is doing over in the USSR. Because Stalin started purging people, anyone that was a potential threat. His big enemy was Leon Trotsky. So Trotsky and any of his sympathizers were basically killed, their reputations were killed, or they were exiled. And that was basically the way Stalin did it. So you can really see this big similarity, the big glaring similarity between Stalin and Hitler. They're doing the exact same stuff. They're doing it under different brands of political extremism, but it's fundamentally the same thing. And then from 1934 onwards, the entire government of Germany is controlled by these radical right-wing nationalists. And now that these militant right-wing extremists are in control of the government, they start doing exactly what you would expect militant right-wing extremists to do. They start expanding territory. And one of the first big moves that they make is the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria. Right? Uniting ethnic Germans. These are people that are cultural, linguistic Germans, and they want to be part of the Reich. Now, Austria has its own weird little dynamic going on with fascism and extremism. Nazism was actually outlawed in Austria, but they were still fascist, if that makes any sense. Engelbert Dollfuss. He was the fascist dictator of Austria. And he did not want to be part of this greater German Reich. He didn't want to have anything to do with that. He thought This was going to bring about chaos and destruction for Austria's well-being. He didn't want anything to do with it. And he even outlawed the Nazi Party. But he was still a fascist. You see, there is a big distinction between fascism and National Socialism. And the big difference being that there is a very strong element of ethno-nationalism within National Socialism or Nazism. We can spend a lot of time talking about the differences between Nazism and fascism. Nazism has a big element of ethno-nationalism, ethnic superiority. That is the big difference that you really need to understand to see why Nazism was outlawed in Austria despite it being a fascist dictatorship. And this is one of my favorite parts of the whole story of World War II. And here's why. No one realizes that Austria was a fascist dictatorship that outlawed Nazism. And I think this is one of those parts of history that is so misunderstood and overlooked because it just doesn't fit a narrative. People want to associate fascism with Nazism, and don't get me wrong, there are some overlapping ideas, there are a lot of similarities, but there are also big differences. Big differences. I mean, Engelbert Dollfuss, this fascist dictator of Austria, he did not want to have anything to do with the political extremism, the radical ethnic hatred that was going on in Germany. He identified it as problematic, as something that probably wasn't going to be good for the country in the long run, and he just didn't want to have anything to do with it. He didn't want to be part of this greater Germanic Reich. He didn't want to join Germany. He didn't want to be annexed. He just wanted to have Austria control their own thing and try out this new idea of fascism. I mean, really, at the time, you can't blame people for wanting to experiment with it or try. I mean, it seemed better than the alternative, Marxism. And we get really wrapped up in judging and denouncing fascism, even though, if you look at the actual fascists, they were not as extreme or as horrible as the Nazis were. And again, Nazism was outlawed in Austria. So that tells you something. That tells you that there are enough differences that it's a completely different branch of political thought. Entirely different. It is not the same thing. And the fascist leaders, Engelbert Dollfuss, Benito Mussolini, a couple others we can talk about, they were not as horrendous, as radical, or as conniving as the Nazis were. Germans of the world unite. That was basically their whole idea. That was their plan, their goal. And all the Germans in Austria, they were included in that plan. And Engelbert Dollfuss was not having any of it. So Himmler started getting involved. He was going to use the SS to arrest Engelbert Dollfuss, the sovereign leader of an independent nation. He was going to go over there, arrest him, and then take over the government. And that's how they were going to get control of Austria. What a great idea. What could possibly go wrong? Well, absolutely everything went wrong. The SS, they got there. They tried arresting him. Obviously, Dollfuss did not want to be arrested. There was a small skirmish going on. There were some shots fired. And it resulted in a sloppy assassination of Engelbert Dollfuss. This resulted in the international reputation of Nazi Germany, and especially the SS, as being a bunch of violent thugs. They didn't just arrest the leader of a sovereign nation now, they killed him. They went over to an independent sovereign nation, said, listen, you're going to get arrested, and then they killed him. That is an act of extreme aggression. And here's the craziest part of the whole situation. When Engelbert Dollfuss got shot, they literally denied him medical treatment. He probably could have lived. So they shot him, denied him medical treatment, and then annexed Austria a couple of years later. That's how Nazis did things. And in that moment, everyone in the world knew that the SS was a bunch of ruthless thugs that would stop at nothing to achieve their end goals. So now we can talk a little bit about Himmler's strange obsession with the occult, and it was weird, man. It was so strange. So Himmler, very early on, had this dislike for Christianity. He was extremely anti-Semitic, and he saw Christianity as something that was under the influence of Jews, right? I mean, Jesus was a Jew. It came from, originally, it was a branch off of the Jewish religion itself. He kind of viewed it as something that was bad for the German people. He was very much influenced by the whole idea of the Aryan master race. He funds this Nazi expedition into Tibet to find the missing remnants of the ancient Aryan race. And I can't help but to find this a little funny because it is like this crazy, weird, pseudo-scientific theory that he acts on. I mean, he really believes in this stuff. And I can't help but think about that one guy who thought the earth was flat, so he tied himself to a missile and launched himself in the sky to see if there really was any curvature around the earth, and the guy died. Like, that's the story I think of when I think about Himmler and his occultism. I mean, you can really see a similarity there. And you have to remember, right, as funny as it may have been, he used the power of the state to indoctrinate and brainwash people into thinking these things as well. I mean, German children during this time, this is what they were taught in school, and they argued that the Germanic race was the leader of the white races, and they were constantly under attack by these inferior races. I mean, he regularly talked about the Huns, the Magyars, the Mongols, the Turks, the Tartars, and now the new modern boogeyman, the new big inferior race that the Germans or the whites had to fight was the Soviet communists. Because you see, they're not white. They are inferior subhumans, and they're going to try and come in and kill us and do a bunch of horrible stuff. So we need to kill them first. This is literally what kids were being taught in school. But you can't forget about the Jews. So how do they tie into this whole concept of the world? Well, this is how Himmler kind of made it out to be. So he argued that the Jewish Bolsheviks, they were the ones that created this communist state. They were the ones behind communism and Marxism. Again, that wasn't a new idea. But he argued that they were using these Asiatic people, these subhumans, these lesser races. These Jews were mobilizing the Asians to fight against the Germans or the Germanic race or the white people, however you want to phrase it. Basically, us versus them, extreme tribalism, and they're coming to kill you. They're the ones that want you dead. And you just have to think, when the government tells you this kind of stuff, it gives you this feeling of being under attack. Being under attack by people who hate you, who want you dead for no reason, by people who are ethnically inferior. So it was a very smart, although evil way to turn the youth into sympathizers and supporters of the regime. And if things had been allowed to continue the way they were going, there probably would not have been like a coming away. If there was not some kind of war that took the Third Reich out of power, it never would have stopped or mellowed out. It would have only gotten worse. It would have only stayed as bad as it was because they indoctrinated the youth. The youth is a very, very powerful thing. And when you have the youth thinking the things that you want them to think, you have control over the future. And especially as time went on, this was something that he must have thought so much about. I mean, he literally referred to the Jewish question in the past tense. Like, oh yeah, we already have a solution for that, the final solution. And I think this is the part of Himmler and the SS and the Third Reich in general that a lot of people don't understand well enough. People seem to be under the impression that the Third Reich only persecuted Jews or ethnic minorities. Not the case. They literally hated Christianity. They hated Jesus. They thought it was a product of Jewish influence. And Himmler even stated that the primary goal of the SS was to restore a Germanic way of living without Christianity. He thought that Christianity was only hindering the German people, the Third Reich. They wanted to get rid of it. And this is why it can be so frustrating to see people try to hold German Christians responsible for the Third Reich. They were not responsible for the Third Reich. They were persecuted by the Third Reich. These people, these Nazis, they were not Christians. They were not followers of Christ. They may have technically been part of a church. They may have attended a few masses in their lifetimes, but they were not Christians. They hated Christians. They wanted the church gone just as much as the Soviet Union did. They wanted Hitler to be the new god of the Third Reich. They did not want Jesus to be part of their new Germanic way of life. And if you were going to argue that Himmler had a rebellion against his father, that he was truly something else spawned against, and if you really wanted to make the argument that Himmler was rebelling against his father, this is something you would have to use in that argument, because this is a complete rejection of the values he was raised with, a complete rejection of the traditional German way of life. Because as radical and as right-wing and as militant and nationalistic as Germany may have been, and they were, don't get me wrong, they were, but they were not anti-Christians. The Reich of Bismarck had Christianity at the center of society. It played a major role. It influenced the lives and the culture and the politics and everything else. They were not trying to get rid of it, but the Nazis were. Himmler wrote about the mission of the SS, saying, quote, "We live in an era of the ultimate conflict with Christianity. It is part of the mission of the SS to give the German people in the next half-century the non-Christian ideological foundations on which to lead and shape their lives." He doesn't want Jesus to be part of this Reich. He wants to get rid of it. That is the primary goal of the SS. But that didn't stop him from using religion pragmatically. I mean, during World War II, he even praised Islam, like the religion of Islam, not just someone who happened to be a Muslim. He literally praised Islam during World War II when a Waffen-SS division was created. And that's another one of those overlooked aspects of the Third Reich. There were a bunch of Muslims who fought for the Nazis. Nothing brings people together like a common enemy. And the Muslims at the time were very anti-Semitic. So they saw the Nazis and they said, you know what? These guys might think we're ethnically inferior to them, but you know what? We can come together. We can join them and get rid of the Jews. And that's exactly what they did. And Himmler, after observing how the Muslim Waffen-SS division fought in combat, he praised Islam, calling it practical, and how it was appealing to soldiers because it promised them heaven even if they fought and died in battle. So you see, religion can be really useful, not if it brings about internal peace within the people that follow that religion, but if it makes them useful in war. If it makes them a useful foot soldier, that's a good religion. Not the religion that brings peace. The one that makes war easier. That is how Himmler viewed religion. And then Himmler just fit so many of these Nazi stereotypes. I mean, he was paranoid about everyone being a subversive Jew, which led him to distrust Emil Morris, an early Nazi party member. And this was despite Emil Morris being Hitler's good friend, a bodyguard, a loyal SS soldier. All of this, I mean, this guy was like a faithful servant of the Third Reich, even though he had some Jewish ancestry. But Himmler, it wasn't enough for him. He was a Jew. So he tried removing Morris from the SS due to his Jewish ancestry. Himmler truly believed that Morris's Jewish heritage made him a security risk. Think about how that must have felt being Morris, Being someone that was raised in this country, you fought alongside all these people, you served faithfully, you're a bodyguard to Hitler, you joined the SS, you do all this stuff serving the regime. And because of your DNA, because of something that is out of your control, someone thinks that you're subverting the movement that you have spent just about your entire adult life fighting for. This is beyond despicable. This is just sad. It's really sad. Heinrich Himmler played a major role in causing World War II because of Operation Himmler. It's literally named after him, right? So, Operation Himmler was this plan by the Nazis to organize false flag attacks that appeared to be Polish citizens ethnically cleansing Germans in Polish territory. So at the time, there were a bunch of Germans, they lived in Poland, and what they did was they had a bunch of Nazis or sympathizers or collaborators. They dressed up like they were the Polish military, and then they started attacking their own citizens, their own ethnic Germans that were living in Poland. And this became the justification for the Third Reich invading Poland. I mean, you have to remember, the invasion of Poland was the reason World War II began at all. Hitler and the Nazis had already conquered so much of Europe. So very much of Europe was occupied by the Nazis already. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. So Operation Himmler went into effect, and it was their justification for invading Poland. Ethnic Germans weren't being killed by the Polish military. The Polish people didn't really mind the ethnic Germans living there. In a lot of these cases, these were Germans who had been living there for like generations. These people were not like randomly being attacked one day by Polish nationalists. It just doesn't happen like that. But Hitler totally went along with it, totally played dumb, shrugged his shoulders and said, listen, there are ethnic Germans under attack in Polish territory. I need to get in there. I need to save these guys. Now, internationally, everyone saw right through it. This was just his excuse to invade another European nation, to get more territory under the control of the Third Reich. And who was put in charge of this occupied Polish territory? None other than Heinrich Himmler. They started killing people, they started deporting people, they started doing all kinds of horrible stuff. And under the directions of Heinrich Himmler, they literally started kidnapping Eastern European children. Thankfully, we have Himmler in his own words to talk about the situation. This is what Himmler wrote about kidnapping Eastern European kids. Quote, obviously, in such a mixture of peoples, there will always be some racially good types. Therefore, I think that it is our duty to take their children with us, to remove them from their environment, if necessary, by robbing or stealing them. Either we win over any good blood that we can use for ourselves and give it a place in our people, or we destroy that blood. Now, you see, he didn't want to kill those kids. He just wanted to steal them and use them for the Third Reich. You see, Himmler wasn't all that bad. What kind of a person can write that and think that and give directions to do that? What kind of a person? And as I'm sure you already know, Himmler was instrumental in the Holocaust. And people try to say that the Nazi higher-ups didn't know about the Holocaust. That's a bunch of propaganda. They totally knew about it, especially Himmler. I mean, he was the guy organizing it. So not only did Himmler know about the Holocaust, he was not at all bothered by it. He said this, quote, it is one of those things that is easily said. The Jewish people is being exterminated. Every party member will tell you. Perfectly clear, it's part of our plans. We're eliminating the Jews, exterminating them. A small matter. A small matter. Ethnic cleansing. Genocide. A small matter. And then he goes on, because of course he has to justify it. Quote, altogether we can say we have carried out this most difficult task for the love of our people, and we have suffered no defect within us, in our soul, or in our character. were ethnically cleansing human beings, murdering them, slaughtering them. It's a little thing, it's no big deal, and we don't feel bad about it. And we're doing it for a good reason. Because we love our people. Because anyone that loves their people does this, right? Anyone that loves their own people kills other people. The mental gymnastics. The absolute insanity. I mean, what goes through his head? What is it like inside of his head? What is his internal monologue like? That this is what he does. This is what he dedicates his life to. And this is how he justifies it. And you know the worst part about the whole situation? He enjoyed it. He literally visited the concentration camps, looked at the prisoners, saw them starving, saw them suffering, miserable, dying. And he enjoyed it. He literally enjoyed viewing their suffering. Because they were not his people. And now I want to bring up something I had been discussing earlier in the episode, the negative father complex. Now that you've seen a lot of what Himmler has done, how he spent his life, how he made his decisions, was he incorporating his father's cruelty and sadism and taking it to the next level? Was this Rex on some level? Was this Himmler adopting his father's horrible sadism and inflicting it on millions of people? Now, despite how horrible the Third Reich was, how authoritarian and cruel and sadistic it was, there are still people that idealize it, that sympathize with it. I mean, there are a bunch of neo-Nazis and stuff that were alive after the regime, and even today, there are people that are sympathizers, which is just horrible. And they idealize a lot of these Nazi figures. But one of them they almost never idealize is Heinrich Himmler. Himmler, even by his own men, even the guys in the SS, they disliked him because of the way he went out. So he betrayed Hitler. He tried signing a separate peace treaty. And then he took the coward's way out. He didn't take responsibility for his actions, his war crimes and genocide after the war. So after the Red Army invaded, Himmler did everything he could to run, to escape being captured and taken captive by the Allies. Well, he doesn't do a very good job of it, and he eventually gets interrogated by this British officer, an officer named Smith. Now, Himmler had been keeping a cyanide capsule in his mouth just so he could get out of it the second he wanted to. The British military had searched his body a bunch of times. They really did not want him committing suicide. They really wanted to keep him alive to make sure he paid for the horrible things that he had done. But one of the places they couldn't check was his mouth. So eventually they have a doctor give Himmler a physical, and he discovers the capsule in Himmler's mouth. He tries getting it out, and Himmler gets a little flighty, so he just decides to bite down, and then he kills himself. That's how he dies. He was dead within minutes. So Heinrich Himmler, the leader of the SS, he didn't live up to the moral virtues of the SS. But that's not the only virtue he didn't live up to. He didn't even meet the racial criteria to have been a member himself. If he hadn't been a politician, an early Nazi member, he never would have been in the SS because his own racial standards wouldn't have put him in there, wouldn't have allowed him to join. He didn't fit his own moral or ethnic virtues. He was a miserable man who lived a miserable life, spreading misery, and died a failure. And that was the life of Heinrich Himmler. If you listened all the way through, I'm just going to assume that you liked the episode. Well, I have good news for you. There is so much more to talk about on Heinrich Himmler. Just for starters, there's the time he brought his 12-year-old daughter to a concentration camp. There's his logic behind his betrayal of Hitler in negotiating a peace with the Allies. There's a lot more specific details on his occult religious beliefs, and much, much more. And it's all available in the Heinrich Himmler Postscript episode. Now, there are two ways you can get access to this Postscript episode. Number one, by becoming a Biocast bonus member over on Patreon, starting at just $2 a month. But that does not just get you access to Himmler's Postscript episode, it gets you access to Trotsky's episode, which is going to be coming out soon, and it gets you access to every single Postscript episode released in the future. There will be many more. They are going to be amazing, and they are there if you want them. Totally yours if you want. The second option is for you if you're only interested in Heinrich Himmler. You can buy Himmler's Postscript episode over at gumroad.com/biocast. If you only want a one-time payment and you're only interested in Himmler, then this is perfect for you. You can find the links to both the Patreon page and the Gumroad page where you can purchase the Postscript episode down in the show notes below. And before we finish up, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. Thank you for understanding the value of history and education. The only way to keep a free society is with an educated mind. And you are definitely doing your part. And I am so grateful that Biocast is a part of that education. Thank you so much. This has been Michael McCauley, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.